A desperate scream cut through the morning silence of the desert like a knife through silence. Convinced that his mind was deceiving him, Silas Crow clung to the bullet hole in his torso with a bleeding palm. A helpless, pure cry cut through the dawn air like steel through his spirit. Despite the fact that dying men alone in the wasteland rarely hear infants weeping, his ribs ached as he drew closer to the noise as he pulled himself in that direction. The best shooter in the Morrison gang had fired the bullet 3 hours earlier. Before taking the initiative, Silas had eliminated 2 of them, but the third had escaped. He had always anticipated a slow, agonizing approach to death now. The weeping intensified as he staggered past a group of worn boulders. What met his eyes made him momentarily forget the fire in his chest. There, positioned in complete isolation, sat a pine casket, child-sized, and from within emerged the unmistakable sound of an infant's frantic sobs. Silas fell to his knees next to the coffin, his vision becoming blurry. The cover was partially open, and through the crack he glimpsed movement. A small fist emerged through the gap. Someone had placed a living infant inside a coffin and abandoned it here for death. His heart nearly stopped as his shaking hands removed the lid completely. A filthy blanket covered an infant boy, maybe 6 months old. The child's face was crimson from weeping, but alive, definitely alive. The baby's gaze met his, and momentarily the crying ceased. But what Silas discovered etched into the coffin lid's interior made his blood freeze. A name, his name, was burned deeply into the wood with rough lettering. Simon Crow, this infant was buried in a casket that bore his name. Someone knew he would discover it. Someone intended for him to find it. Silas felt something break inside his chest that had nothing to do with the bullet wound as the infant reached out to touch him with tiny fingers. He never wanted to cradle a child. Never thought he deserved to. Never thought he deserved to touch something so innocent with hands that had shed so much blood in 37 years of living with a weapon. But Silas realized that this child would die here if he didn't intervene as the baby's cries weakened. And he was dying too. 2 lives dangling by threads in the desert's heart, brought together by someone who knew precisely what they were orchestrating. With trembling hands, the gunman freed the infant from its casket, while holding on to his vest with tiny fingers. The child instantly sat down. For the first time in years, Silas experienced something beyond emptiness in his chest. But who had orchestrated this? Who knew who he was? Who could have predicted that he would continue down this road today? And why abandon a baby to die in a coffin intended for him? Silas was certain of one thing as the sun rose higher and cast long shadows across the desert. This innocent child was at the center of a scheme to manipulate his life. The baby's hold on his vest was remarkably firm for something so fragile. Silas had observed men die with less resolve. He felt warmth spread through his shirt as he held the child against his chest. Not blood this time, but something else entirely. Something he'd forgotten existed. However, staying here would result in their deaths. The desert sun was already climbing, and without water, the baby wouldn't survive 2 hours. Silas had perhaps 4 hours remaining before blood loss claimed him, but that was without carrying additional weight. He would be fortunate to have one with the child. His horse, Thunder, waited 30 yards distant, spooked but sufficiently loyal to remain. As Silas got closer, the animal's chest wound was still dripping with blood, and its ears twitched nervously. Thunder had carried him through 6 years of gunfights and narrow escapes, but never with an infant aboard. While holding the infant in his left arm, Silas was able to ascend the saddle. The child had stopped completely crying at this point, though every movement sent lightning through his ribs. Those dark eyes simply gazed up at him with an expression too knowing for someone so young. Silas's thoughts raced as Thunder started to walk toward the town. Millbrook was 8 miles east, too distant for a dying man. However, something was closer. The old Hendricks home, which had been abandoned for 3 years since the cholera epidemic killed the family. If he could reach there, he might locate supplies, maybe even determine who was behind this twisted game. The infant made soft sounds, not crying but also not completely content. When Silas looked down, he saw that the child was starving. Of course he was hungry. Someone had left him in a coffin to die. No telling his duration there. That's when understanding struck him like a blow to the stomach. The purpose of the coffin was for discovery, not burial. After dealing with the Morrison gang, someone knew his route, his timing, and that he would ride this trail. Someone wanted him to find this baby specifically. Who then? And why use a child as bait? Thunder stumbled slightly, and Silas felt his grip on consciousness slipping. The rate of blood loss was increasing faster than anticipated. He tried harder to close the wound with his hand, but it was like trying to stop a river with his fingers. As if sensing their mutual danger, the baby's eyes never left his face. Those tiny fingers gripped his vest with desperate strength. The smoke rising the distance was then noticed by Silas, not from the Hendricks place, but from somewhere else entirely. Someone had lit a fire, and it was coming from his intended direction. Someone was waiting for him. His free hand moved instinctively to his weapon, but the movement sent fresh pain through his chest. He was riding straight into a trap with a weak body and a helpless baby in his arms if this was a trap. However, what other options did he have? The desert would kill them both if he retreated. Silas couldn't help but feel as thunder carried them toward the smoke, that each step was precisely what someone wanted him to take. Someone who knew about the baby, knew about the coffin, and knew he'd have no choice but to follow this path. The question burning in his mind as fiercely as the bullet wound was simple. Was he rescuing this child, or was this child about to get them both killed? After all, the smoke was indeed emanating from the Hendricks residence. As thunder crested the small hill, Silas saw a figure moving around the abandoned homestead, a woman in a faded blue dress, tending a fire outside the old cabin. She looked up as they approached, and Silas felt his blood chill. That face was familiar to him. Elena Vasquez is the woman whose husband he killed 2 years ago in Tombstone. The woman who had declared over her husband's grave that she would demand payment from Silas for abandoning her children without a father after stealing funds from the bank where she had worked. She was supposed to be hiding in Mexico to avoid detection by the authorities. Now she was here, in the middle of nowhere, with a fire already burning and supplies laid out as if she'd been expecting company. As thunder slowed to a stop 20 feet from the cabin, the infant in his arms started to move. Elena rose slowly, her hands empty but her eyes filled with something darker than hatred. Even though she was getting older and had deep grief lines around her eyes, her stance was firm and dangerous. "Silas Crow," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "Right on time." "Elena," his voice emerged rougher than intended. "You're the one who abandoned the child." She said simply, "My grandson. Miguel's boy born 3 months ago." Like bullets making a mark, the pieces fell into place. Miguel Vasquez, Elena's son, the young hothead who'd been riding with the Morrison gang, the third shooter who put lead in Silas's chest and fled this morning. As he adjusted his grip on the infant, Silas said, "Your boy tried to kill me this morning." The child had gone completely still, as if sensing the tension. "Also, you murdered his father. Seems fair." He had tried, so Elena moved closer and moved her hand to something behind her back. However, Miguel has never been strong enough, and he never finished what he started. So you finished it for him, use his own baby as bait. As bitter as desert wind, Elena laughed. "Diego Vasquez, not Diego Crow, is the name of that baby. Diego Vasquez. You're not saving him, Gunslinger. You're delivering him." Silas felt the trap closing around him like a noose. His gun hand was his right hand, but the baby was cradled in his left arm, and he was too weak from blood loss to draw fast enough. Elena had positioned herself perfectly, close enough to talk, far enough to react if he tried anything. "The coffin," he said, "pieces still falling together. You inscribed my name there." She stated, "Where dead men belong. I thought I'd let you choose. Die here alone, or die knowing you'd save the child whose father you murdered." Miguel said, "Miguel couldn't kill you cleanly." Elena's expression cracked for a split second as the baby Diego made a soft sound, her grandmother's love breaking through to vengeance. "But here's what my boy didn't know," Elena continued, her hand still behind her back. "That baby's sick. Been sick since birth. Needs drugs that we can't afford, drugs that cost more than we'll ever have." Now, Silas understood. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about desperation. "You want my money?" Elena countered, "I want you dead." but I'll settle for your money and your life insurance policy. There is word that you have a bounty of $2,000, and whatever you're carrying." Silas could feel the tiny body trembling, and the baby's breathing now seemed to be shallower. Regarding the illness, Elena wasn't lying. What's the matter with him? Heart condition. In need of surgery in the East. Costs more than most folks see in a lifetime. Elena's voice slightly cracked. "So you're going to give me everything you've got, and then you're going to die knowing that at least you did something decent in your miserable life." However, something in Elena's eyes indicated to Silas that this would not end with just money. She had waited far too long for this moment to permit him to leave, even if she had died. How much time did he have before she stopped speaking and began shooting? In his arms, the baby's breathing became more labored. Silas could feel each tiny struggle for air, and something inside him cracked wider than his bullet wound. This child was dying, and not slowly. Elena hadn't been lying about the heart condition. "How long is his time?" Silas asked, speaking more softly than in years. Elena's composure faltered. Doctor in Millbrook said weeks, maybe days without proper care. That's why. She stopped herself, but Silas could see the desperation bleeding through her anger. "That's why you set this trap. You are not just seeking vengeance. You're trying to save him. Don't you dare try to make this about nobility." Elena snapped. "For $20 in a card game argument, you destroyed my family and killed my husband. This baby is dying because we can't afford to save him." Silas felt like sand in the desert as the weight of every life he had lived settled on his shoulders. Carlos Vasquez had been cheating at cards, true enough, but the man had also been trying to win money to feed his family. Silas had known that and killed him anyway. The baby's eyes fluttered open, looking directly at Silas with an expression that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. Those weren't the eyes of someone dying. They were the eyes of someone fighting. "There's a doctor in Phoenix," Elena continued, her voice breaking. "Surgeon who can fix hearts like Diego's. However, it costs $3,000, which is more money than my family will ever see in 3 lifetimes." Silas had $4,000 in his saddlebags, money from years of bounties, gunfights, and jobs that kept him alive but never let him live. Blood money that had never done anyone any good. "You can have it all," he said quietly. "Each penny. However, you permitted me to see that doctor first." Elena's hand moved from behind her back, revealing an old Navy coat. Her father's gun, if Silas remembered right. "You think I'm fool enough to trust a man who murdered my husband?" Silas said, pointing to blood that was still seeping through his shirt. "I'm dying anyway. Got maybe 2 hours left. 3 if I'm lucky. But if we hurry and get this baby to Phoenix, he might live. Phoenix is 40 miles. You wouldn't make it. Then we go to Millbrook. Doc Harper may be able to stabilize him long enough to make the trip, because he has basic supplies." Elena's gun moved around as she saw her grandmother fighting her widow, love fighting hate. "After everything, why would you help him?" The baby made a small sound, and Silas looked down into those dark eyes again. "Because some things matter more than dying angry." Except for Diego's labored breathing and the crackling fire, the desert was silent for a while. Elena's gun stayed pointed at Silas, but her finger moved away from the trigger. "Miguel's waiting in Millbrook," she said finally. "He'll shoot you on sight if he sees you coming with his boy. Then you better ride with us and make sure he doesn't." Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want me to save the man who killed my husband?" "I need you to save your grandson," I said. Silas felt a sudden surge of panic through him as the baby's breathing became more shallow. Diego's tiny body was limping and his lips were becoming slightly blue. "He's getting worse," Silas said urgently. "We need to move now." Elena saw it too. She stepped forward and reached for her grandson as she lowered her gun. But as her hands touched the baby, Diego's breathing seemed to steady slightly, as if being near family gave him strength to fight a little longer. "There's a wagon behind the cabin," Elena said, her voice thick with tears she refused to shed. "Miguel brought supplies because he thought that we'd need them later. Get it married. Fast." But Silas heard something that made his blood freeze. Hoofbeats as Elena hurried toward the cabin. Multiple horses, riding hard and coming fast. Miguel wasn't waiting in Millbrook after all. He was coming to this location with friends. The ridge was climbed quickly by 3 riders who left behind dust clouds. Miguel Vasquez rode in front, his face twisted with rage even from a distance. Morrison gang members who would always shoot first and never bother asking questions were the 2 men flanking him. Elena heard them too and froze halfway to the wagon. "No, Miguel!" she shouted, but her voice was lost in the thunder of hoofbeats. Silas had a split second to decide whether the baby would live or die. He could try to draw his gun with one hand while holding Diego, but due to the loss of blood, he would probably fail. He could hand the baby to Elena and try to fight, but that would leave the child in the crossfire. Or he could do something that went against every instinct he developed in 37 years of staying alive. He could surrender. He called out, "Elena, take him." She rushed back as the riders thundered into the clearing. Diego was carefully placed in his grandmother's arms by Silas. The baby's breathing had become so shallow that it was no longer noticeable. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she felt how limp her grandson had become. Miguel's horse skidded to a stop, and he had his gun drawn before the dust settled. His face was a mirror of his father's, the same dark eyes, the same stubborn jaw. But where Carlos had been desperate, Miguel was pure fury. "Get away from him, Mama!" Miguel shouted, his gun trained on Silas. "Get away from that baby killer." "Miguel, stop!" Diego was secure in her arms as Elena stood between her son and Silas. He was trying to help. "Help!" Miguel's disbelief cracked in his voice. "He killed Papa. He's the reason Diego's dying." The scene was flanked by the other 2 riders, who spread out. They were now Pete Morrison and his cousin Jake, which Silas recognized. Bad men who'd been running cattle theft and bank jobs across 3 territories. They'd used Miguel's grief for their own purposes without a second thought. "Boy is right," Pete said, his gun also drawn. "Crow has a bounty on his head that is worth more than the medicine this baby needs. We finish him here, collect the money, everybody wins." Silas said quietly, except Diego, with his hands raised and his eyes fixed on Miguel. "Your boy needs that doctor in Phoenix. You kill me now, you'll never have enough money to save him." Miguel's gun swung around. "You're lying. $4,000 in my saddlebags. Sufficient for the procedure, but only if we get him to a doctor in the next few hours." Elena clutched Diego tighter. The baby's breathing was becoming more erratic. "Miguel, listen to him," she pleaded. "Diego is deteriorating." After what he did to Papa, Miguel's voice broke. "You want me to trust him? I want you to save your son." The standoff stretched like a wire about to snap. For guns drawn, a dying man, a dying baby, and a family torn between justice and love. Diego lost precious time as a son, and the desert rose higher and higher. Pete Morrison spat in the dust. "Enough is enough. We didn't come here to hear sad tales. We came here to get a reward." But Jake Morrison was staring at the baby in Elena's arms, and something in his expression had changed. "Pete," he said quietly, "that baby looks real sick." "So what?" "So, I had a child back in Colorado as well." Like gunshot smoke, the admission hung in the air. Silas realized this was his moment, the crack in the resolve he could exploit. Silas told Jake, "Then you know what it's like to watch your child suffer and not be able to help." The gun Miguel had started to shake. Behind him, Pete Morrison was growing impatient, his finger tightening on the trigger. This is only the beginning of Silas's road to remorse. So if you're enjoying the story, please subscribe. But what Miguel decided in the next few seconds would determine if Diego lived to see another sunrise, and Pete Morrison wasn't planning to wait much longer for an answer. Pete Morrison's patience snapped like a dry twig. "Jake, what's wrong with you? We didn't ride Jeer to play nursemaid to some dying baby." Jake said uncertainly, "Maybe we should hear him out," with his gun still raised. "Do you hear him?" Pete's gun swung toward his own cousin. "The man's got a $2,000 bounty on his head, and you want to have a conversation?" Emotions ran through Miguel's face like a battlefield. Desperation to save his son, conflicted with rage at his father's murder. Elena finally shed a tear as she watched her grandson's breathing get weaker by the second. Miguel, Elena whispered urgently. Diego doesn't have time for this. The baby's lips were definitely blue now, and his tiny chest barely moved. Silas had seen enough death to recognize it approaching, and this child was losing the fight fast. Despite the fact that he was swaying in the saddle due to loss of blood, Silas spoke to Miguel in a steady voice. The wagon. Get creative. After we save your boy, we can argue about my bounty. Pete lashed out. Don't listen to him. He's trying to escape. Where will I run away to? Silas gestured to the blood, soaking his shirt. That child doesn't have to die, but I'm going to die anyway. Miguel's gun lowered slightly. Silas had the fleeting impression that the young father might choose his son over retaliation. But Pete Morrison had other plans. Fine, Pete said, his gun swinging back toward Silas. We'll get the bounty right now and figure out the baby later, we say. The shot sounded like thunder as it echoed across the desert, but it wasn't Pete's gun that fired. Pete fell to the ground with a curse that could be heard 3 counties away after Jake Morrison shot his cousin in the shoulder. Jake! Pete gasped, clutching his wounded arm. What's the matter? With his smoking gun still in his hand, Jake said in a low voice, I told you. I also got a child. Miguel's paralysis was broken by the sudden violence. Diego was taken from Elena's arms as he ran to her while holstered his gun. Silas thought for a terrifying moment that they were too late because the baby had stopped moving. Miguel said in a broken voice, He's still breathing. Slightly, but he continues to fight. Elena had already begun her dash for the cabin. The wagon is set up. Miguel, assist me in placing in the back. Pete Morrison, however, was not done yet. His face was twisted with rage and greed, and he was reaching for his gun with his good hand. Despite having a wounded shoulder, Silas saw it happening and made his choice. He pulled out his own gun and fired just inches from Pete's strong hand with the last of his strength, despite the fact that the effort of drawing had nearly rendered him unconscious. Silas said, Next one won't miss. Pete looked up at him with pure hatred. Crow, this is not over. It is, yes. Jake Morrison dismounted and helped his wounded cousin to his feet. We're leaving, Pete. Now. Jake, you're making a mistake. Jake looked at Diego and Miguel's arms and said, Maybe, but I can live with this mistake. Silas felt his strength finally wane as the Morrison cousins rode away, with Pete still cursing and threatening vengeance. He was held upright only by Thunder's steady stance as he slumped forward in his saddle. Elena yelled from the wagon, Miguel, we need to go now. Miguel looked between the man who had killed his father and his dying son. The decision, which just a few moments earlier seemed out of reach, was now crystal clear. Miguel called out to his mother, Help me get him in the wagon. Elena's eyes grew wider. You mean he's coming with us? Diego requires that cash, and Crow's the only one who knows where it is. The gunslinger felt something new as they carefully transferred Silas from his horse to the wagon bed. Not forgiveness. That would take more time than he had left, but something close to it. A chance to die for something other than pride or money. Diego lay beside him in the wagon, both of them fighting for every breath. But Silas gave himself a small glimmer of hope. Maybe this baby would live as Elena took the wheel and Miguel rode along on his horse. All of his blood could possibly be used for good. However, the desert was still putting him to the test, and they still had to get to Millbrook alive. The wagon wheels ground against desert hardpan as Elena pushed the horses harder than she should have. Silas bit back any complaints despite the fact that each bump brought fresh waves of pain through his chest. Beside him, Diego's breathing had become so shallow it was barely visible. Miguel rode alongside the wagon, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Pete Morrison might have ridden off, but men like that didn't forget $2,000 bounties easily. They'd be back, probably with reinforcements. How far are we going? Elena called over the wheels whirring. Miguel replied 3 miles, but his tone suggested doubt. 3 miles was still too far for either of the dying passengers in the wagon bed. With trembling fingers, Silas took out a small leather pouch from his vest pocket. Doc Harper had given him laudanum-based painkillers that were strong enough to permanently put a man to sleep if he took too many. However, they might delay Diego. He called out weakly, "Elena, stop the wagon." "We can't stop. Diego's getting worse. That is why we must halt." The horses came to a hesitant halt as Elena tightened the reins. Miguel quickly got off the horse, his face displaying the strain of watching his son get smaller and smaller every second. Silas held up the pouch. "Pain medicine. Strong stuff. May reduce his need for oxygen and slow his heart rate." Miguel's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You want to drug my baby?" "I want to keep him alive long enough to reach the doctor." Silas's conviction was strong, but his voice was getting weaker. "Doing nothing is certain death, so it's risky." Elena climbed into the wagon bed and looked at her grandson. Diego's lips were nearly purple now, and his tiny fingers had gone limp. She knew the warning signs after watching her husband pass away. "What is it?" she asked Silas. "The pill's quarter dissolved in water. Might buy us an hour, maybe two." As Miguel took the pouch, his hands trembled. What if it kills him? What if it keeps him alive? The young father gave the pills, then his dying son a long stare. It was a gamble with the highest possible stakes, his child's life. "Miguel," Elena said softly, "your papa always said sometimes you have to risk everything to save what matters most." Miguel's eyes filled with tears as he carefully broke off a quarter of one pill. They carefully disintegrated the fragment, using Elena's small water container. They lacked the patience to administer the medication to Diego. The infant was so weak that he had trouble swallowing, and each delay brought him closer to death. But finally, they managed to get the dissolved medicine down. Within minutes, Diego's breathing seemed to stabilize slightly, not better, but not worse. "It's working," Elena whispered, hope and fear clashing on Miguel's face as he got back on his horse. "Let's go." But as Elena snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, Silas heard something that made his blood freeze despite his fading strength. More hoofbeats, coming fast from behind them. Pete Morrison had found reinforcements after all, and this time he wasn't coming alone. With a heavy gun in his hand, Silas forced himself to sit up. Through the dust cloud behind them, he could count at least 6 riders. The Morrison gang was no longer just after his bounty. Instead, they were seeking vengeance for Jake's betrayal and were willing to kill everyone in this wagon. "Elena," he said quietly, "we've got company." The dust cloud was apparent when she looked back. While her grip on the reins tightened, her face became pale. "How long before they catch us?" Silas evaluated their horse's condition and the distance. 10 minutes, maybe less. Diego's breathing remained steady from the medicine, but it wouldn't matter if they were all dead before reaching Millbrook. Miguel had seen the riders too. He spurred his horse closer to the wagon, his gun already drawn. "We can't outrun them," he said. "Not with the wagon," I said. Silas knew what that meant. In order to give the others time to escape, someone would have to stay behind. Additionally, only one member of this group was already dying. But as the hoofbeats grew louder behind them, Silas realized he might not have enough strength left to make his final stand count. While Elena's team was worn out from pulling the wagon across rough terrain, the riders were making rapid gains on fresh horses. Silas could make out Pete Morrison's face now, twisted with rage and determination. The wounded outlaw had gathered every gun for hire between here and the territory line. "Stop the wagon," Silas said firmly. "What?" Elena's voice cracked with panic. "Stop it now. They will catch us in the open ground if we keep running. At least here we have the wagon for cover." With a grim expression, Miguel rode closer. "Would you like to take a stand? 6 of them, and one of you are there." "In a gunfight, I'm not very good." "Then don't fight," Silas said, struggling to climb out of the wagon bed. "Run with Diego. There's a wash about a quarter-mile north. Get there and continue to Millbrook." Elena jumped down from the driver's seat and helped steady him. "You can barely stand. How will you contend with 6 men?" Silas checked his gun for bullets left. "Not nearly enough, but it would have to do. I'm not planning to win, just planning to buy you time." Miguel's voice was firm. "No, I won't let another man die for my family." Silas said, "Your family. and he gave the young father a look that was close to respect. "Boy, you got more backbone than your daddy ever did." The insult should have stung, but Miguel just smiled grimly. Papa always said courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing when you're afraid. The hoofbeats were close enough now to feel through the ground. Diego stirred slightly in Elena's arms, the medicine keeping him stable but still desperately sick. "Elena," Silas said urgently, "take him and go. Now." But Elena Vasquez had spent 2 years planning revenge, and she was about to run from Pete Morrison and his hired guns. She grabbed her husband's old rifle from a wagon and checked the ammunition. "Carlos died defending our family," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time I did the same." The three of them formed a triangle around the wagon as the riders thundered closer. Silas behind the wagon bed, Miguel near the front wheel, Elena crouched by the water barrel. Diego breathed steadily in her arms, unaware that gunfire was about to decide his entire future. Just out of easy pistol range, Pete Morrison and his gang pulled up 50 yards away. They had learned to respect Silas's aim, even though they no longer feared him. "Smart move. Crow," Pete yelled, his injured arm in a flimsy sling. "Your bounty money cost me a lot. It's time to pay," Silas called back, surprised by how strong his voice was. "The only thing I owe you is a bullet," Pete jokingly stated. 6 against 3. Those odds appeal to me. But Jake Morrison wasn't there, and Silas immediately put that information away because he thought it might be important. "Pete, where is your cousin?" He finally developed morality. Pete's face became darker. Jake made his choice. He must now either live with it or die with it. Like a bowstring, the standoff stretched taut. Diego made a soft sound in Elena's arms that sounded almost like contentment rather than distress. He was able to fight for a little longer because the medication was working. The desert air seemed to be shaken by that insignificant sound. With a strong hand, Pete Morrison pulled out his gun, and the gunfire began. Pete's left rider was killed by Silas's first shot before the man could clear leather. His chest pain caused his second shot to miss, but it scared another horse and sent its rider flying. Elena's rifle spoke authoritatively, dropping a third man from his saddle. Despite Miguel's complete miss, Silas noticed that his strength was rapidly dwindling, but 3 guns against 6 was still a losing proposition. His hands were beginning to shake, and his vision was becoming blurred due to the loss of blood. Splintered wood near Silas's head was struck by Pete Morrison's return shot, sending fragments flying. The next volley would probably be the last one he'd ever hear. But then, from the ridge behind Pete's gang, came the sound of a rifle shot. One of Pete's men pitched forward, and chaos erupted in their ranks. Nonetheless, Jake Morrison had returned with friends. Silas gave himself one last smile as the Morrison gang was caught between 2 groups of gunmen. Maybe Diego would make it to that doctor after all. Even in the harsh desert, there might be happy endings to some stories. Although brief, the gunfight was fierce. When the dust settled, Pete Morrison lay face down in the sand, and the surviving men were riding hard for the horizon. Jake Morrison emerged from the rocks with 2 other men Silas didn't recognize. Jake looked down at his cousin's body and said, "Told you this ain't over." "Guess I was wrong." While Diego's breathing remained constant, Elena tightened her grip on Diego. The medicine had bought them the time they needed, and now the path to Millbrook was clear. Silas sat down hard against the wagon wheel as he felt his legs give way. His vision was getting darker around the edges. But Diego was alive. That had to have some significance. "Miguel," he said weakly, "my saddlebags for $1,000. Get your child to see that doctor." Silas closed his eyes and felt peace for the first time in 37 years of war, as Miguel went to get the money that would save his son's life. The desert sun climbed higher, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, Silas Crow wasn't running from anything. He was precisely where he had to be and carrying out exactly what had to be done. Additionally, that infant would survive. If you enjoyed the story of redemption in the Old West, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage, sacrifice, and second chances. You can now hear a story that is even better than this one by clicking on the video on the screen. It has a twist that is so powerful that you won't forget it soon. Select the video.